folks who are just getting connected to our webinar here. I'm Lee Allness with Borrego, and we'll be getting started in just a moment. We'll give everybody just a couple seconds here to get connected and get logged in and get their audio working. We could use this time right now. Typically at Borrego O&M, we start meetings with a kind of a safety moment where we like to go into the specifics on a specific safety topic. We don't have time really to go through that today, but I'd just like to ask all of you to keep safety first and foremost in everything you do. That's our policy at Borrego, and it's really critical for us as an industry, I think, and just for our own teams and such. So please do keep safety in mind with all of your O&M activities. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started with our webinar today. We're going to be talking about how to plan for the right O&M for your PV projects earlier in the solar development project prospects. Again, my name's Lee Allness. I'm a senior business director with Borrego O&M. I'm joined today by an industry panel of experts, and we will talk about some of these key pieces as we get into it. So next slide, please. So we'll go ahead and introduce our panel. Our format today will just be an informal panel discussion. I hope that we can get through some really good questions. There will be time at the end for all of you in the audience to enter some questions into the Q&A on the webinar. So please feel free to do that as we're going along. But I have prepared a number of questions that we'll dive into with our panelists. But before we do that, I'd like to just go in order and let our folks introduce themselves, say a couple words about your background and what your company does in the industry. So we'll start with Kim.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Primerano. I'm the Vice President of Development with Estuary Power. I have about 15 years actually on the operations side of the house. I joined Estuary Power about 2 years ago. We are a majority-owned renewable energy developer, very soon to be owner-operator, based in Reno, Nevada. Our projects are Intermountain West, and our pipeline is a little over 2 gigs. And I'm really excited to talk about this because it's kind of why I moved from operations to development.
Excellent. Lindsay with Silicon Ranch.
Hey there, so I'm Lindsay Tibbs, Director of Asset Management at Silicon Ranch. I've had about 15 years in energy, but 7 of that in solar. And I kind of did the opposite of Kim. I started on the development side, moved into the construction management, and then over into operations. At Silicon Ranch, we have a portfolio of 1.6 gigs today, but in the next 2 years, we'll add another 2 gigs. So we are quickly growing. We're in 14 states across the US, everything from DG to large scale utility.
Fantastic. Mike Howell is with us today from EDPR.
Hi, hello everybody. I've been in the solar industry for 33 years. Kind of got started as an installer, worked for a couple of module manufacturers, and ultimately found my way over to the ownership side of the business with EDPR. Right now, focused in the distributor generation arm of EDPR North America. Globally, EDPR is the 4th largest owner and operator of renewable assets. We have just over 8.2 gigawatts of solar and wind in North America, and I specifically oversee the asset management for the DG business, which includes about 500 projects and 250 megawatts.
Excellent. And Ben Zanetti with DNV.
Hi there, everyone. My name is Ben Zanetti with DNV, as you mentioned. I'm the team lead in utility solar project management for technical due diligence here in the solar independent engineering team. I've been with DNV a little bit over a year and a half, coming from approximately an additional 6 years of experience in both O&M and asset management. Just a bit about the company. DNV is the largest global technical consultancy in the world for independent engineering and works across all renewable sectors.
Excellent, thank you. with that, why don't we jump to the next slide and begin to dip into our topic for today. Our goal is really with today's webinar is to highlight the importance of thinking early and often about O&M for your solar projects. And from the outset, I just want to clarify, we're not saying that people don't think about it. It certainly does get thought about in the early stages, but how much you delve into it, how careful and accurately you estimate the costs, and how frequently you come back and revisit those things are what are critical here to really avoid excess costs down the road. So I think it'll be quite valuable to really dig into this. But another key point, really, and we heard Mike mention a vast experience with lots of DG projects. Ben has got quite a background in looking at utility O&M from that scale. And so there may be different factors in play in those two ends of the market and everything in between. So it is something to think about as you go. The smaller the project, probably some of these pitfalls we'll talk about are pretty small, but the bigger the projects tends to become more and more important for us to think about these things. So with that, let's look at some of the topic ideas on the next slide that we're really thinking about here. And clearly, one of them is, how do you close the loop between your O&M team and your development team? Assuming you maybe have those both in-house. Sometimes your development is coming from elsewhere and you're dealing with another company, but frequently, we divide ourselves up in our companies, and we can become compartmentalized or siloed a bit in that regard. So we want to think about that and how to work together. We want to think about some strategies for smoother operations. How can we stop surprising each other with a new project that comes out? Things of that nature. What are some of the misconceptions and pitfalls when O&M becomes a last-minute decision? Maybe you thought you had everything lined up, but lots of stuff can change in those final days, weeks, and months of the development cycle. So it's really important there. You may have a really good EPC team out there building your project for you, but even so, we've seen cases where that handoff, that critical time when EPC is turning the project over for operations, there can be fumbles, there can be punch lists that don't get addressed, and it really can back up on the O&M team trying to take that over, and could result in additional costs for you as an owner that really should have been covered by the EPC. So there's some critical information there as well. And then, there's definitely ways to think about, how do we maximize performance? How do we reduce the number of truck rolls? How do we deal with some of the extreme weather and other things that can hit us? And it's critical. There's new technologies coming about every day, robotic mowing and washing and aerial inspection and different monitoring techniques. So there may be some areas where technology can help us with some of these kind of problems. So what we'd like to do is really ask our panelists to share some examples, some ideas, some history, anecdotes and such that they've experienced going through some of their projects. So let's jump to the next slide and begin to kind of think about questions like, what do these developers and operators actually think about with their O&M plans, and how do they deal with those costs? So just to kick it off, why should solar developers take O&M into consideration? And Kim, you mentioned that you've had experience on both sides, in development and on the O&M side. So what were some of the things that led you to make that change, and kind of see what it was that would make that O&M go smoother with the design to O&M step?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I think some of the big things for me, like in historical sites, were not understanding the geography and the scope and the breadth of the experience of the O&M provider. Some O&M providers can be really great in the Southwest, but maybe not as good in the Southeast, which is kind of totally understandable because O&M is about people. Not understanding, you know, the level of experience for the technicians. You know, when I first took over some distressed assets, there were a lot of tracker problems. And I think because there was so much focus on the electrical side of the house that people just, the mechanical side was an afterthought. And I think that, you know, really can hurt you in the long run. And it's like a 30% loss, right? If your trackers aren't working. And so I think just really understanding if it's, you know, the weather conditions, extreme weather is something that you have to think about, and you should be thinking about how you're planning for that in your O&M plan and the timing. I think actually, you know, taking over budgets and just understanding, you know, if there's going to need to be vegetation or washing or dusting or, you know, like you were talking about with robotics, like I think sometimes if it's not thought about early on, then the actual costs that need to be budgeted for are not included. And really digging into a scope of work and the contract details, I think that is something else that, you know, I had inherited a few contracts and there were a lot of not owner-friendly provisions in them that made it really difficult to transact. And I just think that wrapping your head around those things early and making sure that you budget for them is kind of key to success. I mean, if you think about it, we're building projects with 40-year lives, like our PPAs right now are 35 years. You can really set yourself up for a painful future if you're not thinking for the long game.
Do you have some examples where, you know, things didn't get looked at early enough on, and then all of a sudden your O&M budget went way up? I mean, is it a case where you've seen things double in price, or is it just kind of an incremental expense at the last minute that nobody thought about?
I mean, you kind of see both, right? Like I've walked onto sites and had trees growing in the middle of my array. I've also had sites where you couldn't access them because there was an RV park in front of them. Like there's all these really great ideas of where you can put solar because it's really useful. But I think when you're designing the site and you're pitching the site for your off-takers, you're not necessarily thinking about, oh, hey, we need to have access for the O&M trucks and things like that.
Yeah.
You know, off the top of my head, I can't think of like the numbers that I had to quantify. I can tell you I was over budget every year for about 4 years.
Sure.
So, yeah, so those are all things that I'm thinking about now, and I'm talking to my O&M providers, you know, quarterly for projects that are going COD 12 months from now, right? And we're really detailed in the scope of work, and I'm only talking to people that, you know, are on the reservations where my sites are, that are like know the geography, that know the weather conditions too, so that we can plan out when we're doing the maintenances and things like that.
That's excellent. And certainly in my work here at Borrego, estimating and quoting projects, I do see quite a number of unique or challenging situations come across my desk. And Mike, I know that you've dealt with a number of those with all the projects that you've bumped up against. What are some of the kinds of strange sites or unexpected things that have popped up as you've acquired some properties or projects and had to deal with those?
Yeah, most definitely. The some of the big things that I kind of see, let's say, being overlooked on the development side is the physical design of the sites. Just like Kim mentioned, access to the site is definitely an issue, but we also have to think about access to the equipment itself. Carports is the first kind of system that comes to mind for me. And typically, we'll see a lot of string inverters in the carports. We elevate them to keep the public safe, keep hands off of them on that side. But then now the O&M, whenever they have to work on the inverter, there isn't an easy way to put an extension ladder on it, or it's too high for an A-frame platform ladder. So it turns into a lift rental, which gets expensive. with every truck roll, to tack on an extra almost $1,000 at times for a lift rental. It adds up pretty quickly. And then also the physical placement of those inverters. I've seen a lot of designs where let's just use a generic store as an example, where the store is your off taker, so all your cabling is going to run from the parking lot towards the store. So it's natural for an EPC to think, I can save money by putting the inverters close to the store. It's less AC cabling that he has to do. But that's also where the public's going to park first. They're going to park closest to the store. So if all of our AC equipment is on that store side, it creates a problem for O&M. So when we see EPCs and engineers submit drawings like that, we catch it now and force the equipment to move into areas that are either at not necessarily on grass islands, because we have to be able to get lifts into them on that side, but in locations where we can block off parking and where it's just less likely for the public to actually park, so we can access the equipment that we need to.
Yeah, it is an interesting detail, and certainly one piece of our onboarding process is a simple question like, where do you want us to park our trucks when we're there? So that we're not irritating the owner or off taker there. So it does come down to a lot of small details. How can you find out about those things up front, Mike? Is it really just studying the drawings, or do you make site visits, or do you recommend your O&Ms to go out and do a pre-visit to look at everything?
Yeah, what we've actually found that works pretty well is we pull the operations, I guess, forward in the process. So we're doing drawing checks at 10, 20, 30% before they have final drawings complete. But at that point, the equipment is already laid out. And when we're looking at it, we're actually putting the hat on, like we're the O&M provider. If I have to access this equipment in the field, how am I going to do it? And we found it pretty successful to provide that feedback to the engineering designers at that early stage. Now they can move the equipment without a whole lot of fuss and then start the design from there again.
We certainly appreciate that that level of thought, although again, it can be on a scale. You work for a much larger organization, certainly have a lot of experience, but there are quite a number of much smaller players in the industry who maybe are not thinking of all those things. So hearing some of this from you is I'm sure quite valuable. Some of the other kind of unique sites that I've seen, we do work on quite a number of landfills that have things you've got to work around. Cranberry bogs, floating solar is becoming more talked about, at least. I don't know if it's out there everywhere, but we've got at least one of those, I think, in our portfolio. Have any of you worked with some of those kind of projects, and are there considerations related to that, or maybe other sites like a prison complex where access is a challenge?
So I can speak to that. Go ahead, Kim.
No, I was just going to say, I've had sites that were on ports, and you have to have a TWIP card, and you have to make sure that the O&M provider knows that ahead of time. I have sites that are on tribal lands, and so you need the TARA, which is the Tribal Employment Rights Ordinance, needs to be taken into consideration. Access and making sure that you're not speeding or being disrespectful to the land. Those are types of considerations that we try to make sure our O&M providers are aware of, and we feel like they have a good level of comfort ahead of time. Lindsay, take it. I know you have some really interesting ones.
Yeah, I was going to echo your thoughts on the prison access, and it can not only be troublesome up front, like you said, you try to prep the next provider. We've just hit some gaps between providers and having months to get access to those sites. But the other one of interest I was going to mention is in the areas where you are allowed to build in wetlands. I think someone said, there's a lot of places we can put a solar site, maybe some places we shouldn't. Those create a huge issue when you have an inverter down and you're trying to maintain it with 4 feet of water underneath the technician. You cannot do that. It's unsafe. And when that water is standing for 3 or 4 months, that can be a major issue. And so while I appreciate that we are being exploratory in the areas that we can build, we need to take the full cost of that into account.
Excellent. Yeah, those are not the things you want to find out by accident, where we've got the PM scheduled for the middle of June and we get out and find out, well, the rainy season just got done here and it's standing water. So that's never going to be good. Mike, you mentioned some of the practices that your teams put in place to review those drawings and plans more often. Are there other best practices for trying to keep operations and development together? I know from my own industry experience that sometimes, that maybe even the operations and development are two separate legal entities within your same organization. So there's already that compartmentalization, and there may be cases where there just isn't much communication there, almost a siloing of these groups. Are there other things that can be done to get a feedback loop, and how early should people be starting to estimate those O&M costs and getting that piece done?
Yeah, absolutely. The earlier the better for anybody that's kind of looking to get in, I guess, on that ownership side of the business itself. And the way we kind of tackle it is with essentially a living document, a design specification that we work with. So as we see things in the field that are occurring, we instantly give that feedback to our engineering teams. We have different lists that we record what we're seeing on with specific examples. And then that document is updated on a pretty regular basis. This way, as new projects are quoted, designed out, whether it's our in-house engineers, an engineer we hired, or an external EPC, everybody's referencing that same design specification. And then we do try to take it a step further as well by in our regular meetings with the construction teams of if we do see something in the field that could affect projects that are under construction, we make sure we openly communicate that and tackle that with change orders while the projects are still underway. It's so much easier to fix things while the construction teams are physically on site than trying to do it on the back end with O&M teams that quite frankly just aren't prepared to have that same level of equipment to the site to be able to do the work that's needed at times.
Are you able to get those O&M proposals or contracts repriced in a timely manner when you do run into changes and you see that, okay, they switch this one from central to string inverters, or we have a whole new racking system out here, or now it's a single axis tracker?
Yeah, it's repricing it on that side. It's definitely, there's certain triggers that we keep in mind, and it's the exact ones you just mentioned where we know right away that that's going to directly affect the O&M costs in that side. So we go back, we reprice it, replan it. We make sure that our internal budgeting models are all up to date on that side of things.
Excellent. Anyone else have any comments or follow up on the business of getting your O&M to talk to your development?
Sure. So at Silicon Ranch, it's pretty similar to what Mike described. We may be a little bit slower. It sounds like Mike can get things in while the projects are under construction. We are pretty much tied to it once it gets to that point. But 2 to 3 times a year, we do have project spec updates where things from all across the organization get incorporated, but especially from O&M. And then in addition to that, weekly, we actually meet on the top 9 to 10 issues affecting our fleet performance. And we prefer for it to be less than 10, but just the top things that are affecting our performance, which are generally equipment specific. And so we have started to include our procurement group, our development group, our engineering group in that, so that they can hear this inverter is having these issues, and this is the sort of response we're getting back on, from the warranty. This is how it's working out, so that we know in the future when we make future purchases, it really affects those future purchases. We also have strong data that goes along with that, so we're not just speaking from emotion, we're speaking from actual availability of the equipment and what we have been able to actually get out of that equipment. One other, I say small thing, it's not so small, is we will take test projects. So smaller projects will get things we're trying out. so that we can collect some data ahead of time, feed that back through the loop and try to work in, did that equipment work well? Should we put it on a larger site or should we test it on another smaller site before we move on?
Excellent. So we've talked a bit about, kind of these early cycle surprises, oh, we just got this project or it's ready to go live and now we see these things. But let's turn a little bit and think about some of the other gotchas that may come up when we're thinking about the long term, the life cycle of these plants. And Ben, I know you at DNV have done quite a bit of work on thinking about that long term, and what are the things that pop up and cause that kind of lumpiness in your revenue or financial returns that none of us want to see. So why don't we turn to that? And I know you had put together a couple of slides that we might jump to here to talk to.
Absolutely. This is a second to Lindsay's point about equipment selection and equipment quality, equipment failure rates. A lot of technical due diligence has to do with, are you getting good equipment in the field? And if we can jump to the first slide I prepared there, it shows you a bit of a reason why. So here you have to select your project, how long the lifespan is, what type of equipment failure rate are you willing to accept, what type of degradation you're willing to accept, where are you going to be along the inverter replacement curve. It comes down to the economics. So there's a lot of cost benefit analysis, and you have to understand where you're going to be before you make those decisions to make that purchase. Because you can buy the lower quality equipment or the higher failure rate equipment, but it will cost you in the long run. Is it worth it? Is a good question. So let's take a look at a quantified example on the next slide. So if you can go to the next one. Perfect. So using DNV's estimation tool that uses statistical failure rates to develop a concept of equipment and labor costs for preventative and corrective maintenance. I did a quick model at a 200 megawatt typical site in let's say Texas, for instance, this one. And what would be the resultant additional corrective and preventative maintenance costs over the lifespan of the project. And you can see that the area between the curves of a low failure rate and a high failure rate project and equipment selection is quite drastic. It's up to 75% over the lifespan of the project. Now, you may not see that in the first 5 to 10 years, but over the lifespan of a 35-year project, it's quite significant. So imagine how much a 75% increase would be on your OpEx expenses and the likelihood of tripping some covenants in your financing agreement could be quite significant. I just want to wrap it up with the next slide that illustrates you can put the extra effort in early on to avoid those costs. That it does require some extra work on the development side, and a lot of people who are developers, maybe they're pretty slim outfits and they want to avoid that, but it could be a high value item both in construction and in operation to limit your unforeseen expenses and just generally get your operations under control. So early life cycle work is so valuable. And from DNV's perspective, the extra due diligence is definitely worth it in the long term.
That's really interesting. Could we go back one slide for a quick?
Absolutely.
We see the big jump at 10 years there. And is that really the effect of a lot of warranties coming to fruition, or
yep.
Is it a common point where projects get sold or traded around?
It's more the combination of two things. One is warranties ending for inverters and trackers. Typically, they're around 10 to 15 years. I estimated 10 years in this. And also the kick in of the inverter reserves. So the reserves start paying out. So if I can go to the slide previous, I'll actually show you. So so you'll see that there's the first inverter replacement curve. That's around 10 years, typically 10 to 15. And then there's a follow-up again, 10 years after that, where there's a second round. And if you're up to 35, 40 years, there may be a third round. And a lot of people don't necessarily plan for that in the early stages. So it's very important to ensure that is integrated into your plans.
Yeah. at that point, would you be looking at, much higher wattage modules and such, I imagine? So there could be quite a bit of repowering work done at that stage.
Yeah, we do in our models, we do have some level of repowering, repaneling aspect built in. So we do try to predict that. Some of that's offset by the expected predictions of module cost declines, although that with the current supply chain issues, in the near term, that may not be hyper accurate, but in the long term, we do expect modules to decline in cost. So some of that is a bit of a cost benefit analysis over time as well.
When you run those kind of models, are you guys able to kind of work in spare parts availability and other variables like that? Certainly in the last 2.5, 3 years, we've seen challenges with the supply chain. We've seen just issues with getting the parts we need in a timely manner. We've certainly seen that getting worse as projects get older. So as they're beyond that 10-year or 15-year life cycle point, it's getting harder to get replacement parts, and sometimes some repowering is done on arrays where you just can't get stuff that will fit anymore. So what have you seen with those kinds of considerations? Is there enough spare parts planning happening up front? Are people taking the supply chain issue to heart and making special arrangements to prevent those kind of downtimes?
That's a very good question. And we're seeing a shift in, so our model does take account to some of that, especially on the model side, not as much on the inverter side, because it's hard to see which parts are going to be available. But we do see in the due diligence phase, which is really nice to see in early on, some really innovative products coming out from the OEMs, the inverter manufacturers in specific, where they guarantee availability for a certain number of years, 25 to 30 years. Even more than that, they have a re-warranty from the OEMs who are willing to do the operations and maintenance as well, such that it can be up to 35 years. Now, that's a pretty unique product, and it's hard to say if that cost benefit is there or not. Certainly from a de-risking point of view, that has benefits, but there's definitely some unique products and a bit of a shift in mindset to either contracts that involve parts assurances or full-on O&M. Some people go in the mid-terms. Some people also extend warranties as well. So it's good to see that is being prepared for in the diligence side.
In your next slide, you had modeled a 200 megawatt plant there. How would this, can you speculate how this would change at 20 megawatts or 2 megawatts or 200 kW? I'm sure it's quite different, but what's the impact as we look across the broad range of projects we're dealing with?
Yeah, obviously it's easier to model a larger site because you just have statistics kick in when you have 150 inverters versus 5 or 6.
Yeah.
So it's much easier to rely on the statistics. So the model does become less accurate below 50 to 20 megawatts, somewhere in that range. And we are adapting to the more DG space over time. The issue is an individual DG site might have only a few inverters, and if one of those inverters goes kaputs, that's a much larger availability problem than 1 out of 150. So obviously there's some situations there. On a portfolio level, it does work out. Obviously, the costs in general for DG is slightly higher or can be substantially higher in some cases than utility. So it's the indicative trend is still there for the lower side on the lower sized sites on the aggregate level, but it's really hard to predict the individual.
Interesting. Turning to some of our other panelists, what's your take on some of those graphs there and thinking about that cost benefit of planning for O&M way up front versus not doing so well at that? Do you have any examples of those kinds of things where you've seen it affect your project success down the road?
Yeah, I can put one out for you, and just to kind of reinforce something that's been said about the spare equipment. Spare equipment at the sites is really key. truly understanding the where the single points of failures lie. And if the site is small and maybe you can't afford to buy spares for each site, look at it from a portfolio level and see if you could buy some of those spares and sit them in a warehouse and ship them to the sites as you need them. And then just thinking through the shipping of materials, I guess just looking at trackers for a second, some of the spare parts on trackers, if you need a spare drive shaft, for instance, they're over 20 foot long. So if you have one or two that break in the field, shipping that on a dedicated flatbed is just going to be tremendously expensive. So that's where this spare parts planning at time of development really comes in the phase. That way, when that initial PO is going out to buy that tracker, you're looking at what spare parts are needed and buying those at the same time, preferably at that nice bulk discounted price. And then if you're planning it correctly, you have a container on site where you're just putting all your spare parts in a controlled environment so that they're there for the operations team and the O&M teams when they need them.
Yeah, and to add on to what Mike's saying there, up front is the best time to get spare parts. But I think the reason we end up with an insufficient amount is that we're still working as an industry to really have a true cost of O&M. And so it doesn't get into the business case at a sufficient level. Our C-suite isn't fully up to speed on what the cost is post COD. I think that it's not just, our C-suite. I think if you haven't worked in operations, you probably don't have a full view of what it really costs. So I think really, and this has been kind of my mission lately, is we need to do some data gathering, some additional. I think there's a little bit of data out there on the true cost of O&M, especially at the utility scale, and educate our leadership on the cost of this so that spare parts are a given. They see the value of having them early and having them, like Mike said, large parts delivered to site early on. And then you replenish over time. You deal with moving those large parts later, but you have them right away because the number of failures that happen just after the EPC leaves are incredible. And you need them to keep your site online. So I just really think we have a challenge as an industry. So Ben, DMV, I would love to work with you guys and whoever else to kind of put out white papers and information that help us tell the story, that really show kind of the key equipment and its benefit to the overall performance of your site and really meeting that business model expectation.
Hit me up.
Yeah, and I can tell you that I've certainly seen cases where people did think about spares up front. They did build it into the EPC contract, but no one thought about the details. And at the last minute, it's like, hey, O&M provider, could you magically store 30 pallets of modules for us? And we don't have any place on site for that. So that it's real challenging at the last minute to come up with things like that. It's nice that there are parts, but and modules are some that can be stored kind of out in the elements. But keep in mind, there are many spare parts for these systems that need temperature controlled storage. So that, back to Mike's point, having a central pick and ship location for your parts that would address a portfolio that may be regional or national is a really good idea. And
Lee, if I might, it also would be really nice if O&M providers had that as a service offering.
Yeah, I think it is certainly on the
I've
table.
had that conversation with Borrego for many, many years.
It's pretty challenging and expensive, and we are in a pretty low margin business, and every time we have to ratchet those things up, it is challenging to find it and do it cheap enough. We've also got the concerns that many storage places are not full 24-hour access. An easy mini storage doesn't necessarily allow you to get a pallet jack in there that could move a central inverter in and out easily. So it's not easy, like most of what we do. But
Lee, I think one thing along the lines of what Kim is saying, one thing that probably wouldn't, and maybe there are O&M providers providing this, I just haven't been offered to date, but for those who are getting their fleets off the ground and maybe don't have the historical data, or you're introducing new equipment, you guys in the O&M space probably have some really good data on failure rates of specific equipment. So maybe suggested spare parts to be purchased. That could be really useful to some folks who either are starting out, don't have good peer contacts. It'd be a really good list of information.
Yeah, we do indeed work to keep a lot of that data, and we're building that database. We're a little bit hesitant to, we don't have data like a Consumer Reports would about, consumer products, and we don't want to, go out and badmouth somebody's equipment just because we happen to see a few failures of it. It doesn't mean that it was across the board. Could have been random. So we try to be cautious with that. But I think you're right. Over time, we're going to have a huge data brick that will help the industry with that kind of consideration. So if we turn our attention a little bit to thinking about getting those projects across the line and into operations, what are some of these kind of commissioning fumbles that we've seen? It is the place where the baton can get dropped really easily, because all the momentum of development and EPC is done. Everybody's patting each other on the back about what a great job they did getting it built and finished. There's groundbreaking, there's ribbon cutting, all that stuff has happened, and all the joy and excitement has evaporated, and now we got to operate. So what are the things what are the pitfalls that you've seen, Mike, in lots of those projects you've brought across the line?
Yeah, one common one, and in talking to other asset managers in the industry as well, I know I'm not alone on this one. Kind of the accuracy of the as-built drawings, kind of coming over from ultimately the engineers through construction and being handed over to the operations side, and it's some of the small things that are kind of difficult to verify during those commissioning. So I'll kind of throw that in as the fumble. And just to give a specific example, simple inverter labeling. We're looking at an online platform. We see inverter 20 is offline. We send the O&M out. He gets out in the field, inverter 20 is working fine. Turns out inverter 13 is the one that's off. And now all of a sudden we realize that every inverter in the field is mismatched, mislabeled, maybe even not even labeled accurately to what the as-built drawings show, and it doesn't match the data acquisition platform. So it's kind of pulling all that together, comparing the as-builts to not only what's in the field to what's in the DAS. Just connecting all those final dots for the operations and ultimately for the O&M teams.
Excellent. Certainly one of the key points, if you do know that there's something coming along that is going to require O&M work on day one of your site, it's really helpful for us to know about that stuff. So, it might feel a little embarrassing to have to say, well, we're delivering you something that isn't working, but it's just better to know about it up front, because then we can plan and schedule for it. We're going to get out there eventually, even though we didn't know about it on day one. So if something has gone wrong, let's have those discussions. And in some cases, I have been able to talk to customers who've said, oh, the site's really going to need to be mowed. And I said, well, typically the EPC, when they're done, that's the last thing they do. They should tidy up that whole site, make sure any construction debris is gone. And usually people are like, oh, great. Yeah, let me go back and check our contract. I'll make sure that happens. And particularly right now, while we've got a nationwide labor shortage and things like mowing and washing are as challenging as they've ever been, that's a really great thing to try and catch at that phase if it can be done. Any other examples folks had on the commissioning stage and how you can get stuff onboarded and up and running quick and easy?
Well, I guess I think that there might be a little bit of a difference between onboarding a DG site and a utility site.
Sure.
I think the handover, the O&M provider is on board before the site goes COD, and that O&M provider is doing thermal scans and torque checks and site walks and reviewing as-built, so that there is a little bit more of a time to add that stuff to the punch list. And I'm not suggesting that it's perfect on the utility side, but I do think because there is a larger budget and there is a dedicated staff, it is a little bit easier to try and catch those things before the EPC closes out.
Yeah, excellent. That's a really good point. The bigger the project, the more attention, the more budget, and
Well, it's death by 1,000 cuts. So like if you don't catch it, the more issues you have, right? So yeah.
yeah.
We found too, Lee, that we can get some surprises at commissioning that we didn't know about. Things, unique setups like we talked about earlier. One I'm thinking of off the top of my head is a site where the substation is really going to be maintained by the utility. And so just knowing how that relationship works day one would be really, really helpful. But one thing me and my team have talked about is we're probably never going to get the development and the PPA teams and all that coming to us telling us what they've signed up for. So we're going to have to go ask. So we're creating that document now. We're setting up the meeting. We're asking the hard questions to try to pick apart those agreements and figure out what sort of agreements we've made so that we'll know day one what we need to be doing.
And certainly in distributed generation, when you're behind the meter, there's another variable, which is utility trips and such that are kind of unknown to you. You're not exactly sure what the grid looks like in that area. You may have done some studies and things, but those can be surprises as well, that you're ending up with a lot more resets and truck rolls for those reasons than you ever expected. So that's another area that we do see sometimes. Another real challenge, I suppose, and when we look at the industry and the different players who are involved, we have developers who are separate units and all they do is develop. They may take the project all the way to shovel ready. They may build it and plan to sell it right away to a larger player who will manage it. And then we have others who are certainly build to own developers who are looking at the very long term, those 20 to 30 plus year investments, and can have a different attitude. So I'm just kind of wondering, what are some differences in the O&M approaches that you see out in the marketplace between some of those developers who are really looking to just get it permitted, get it constructed perhaps, and off the ground, and then it's somebody else's, versus the long-term player who's really going to try and own that asset forever, essentially.
I can take this one. Until 3 weeks ago, we were Estuary Capital Partners and we were a develop to sell shop. And when I joined the team, being the only one with operations and asset management experience, it was, we got a quote. And I was like, well, what's the scope of work? Like, what's included? What's the warranty language around all of the equipment? Like some of the stuff is negotiable. Some of the stuff we should be pushing back and have a little bit more of an owner-friendly language involved. And I don't want to say it wasn't like ill intent. There was some motivation to keep costs down and returns high, but no one was thinking about what life was going to look like 35 years from now. And we recently brought on a large investor, and their primary goal is long-term returns and not necessarily the super high returns of a development shop. And so now we're slowing down a bit, and it's, actually negotiating really good warranty terms and paying attention to super, super small details and refreshing those quotes constantly and building the relationships before the relationships need to be in place. And I think that's kind of the biggest difference that I've seen so far.
Interesting.
We really sell that to our customers. We work with a lot of small EMCs and co-ops throughout the Southeast and in the Midwest and Northeast. And that's what we bring to the table, is that build to own structure, because we feel like, as Kim said, your mind shifts from the short term to the super long term, and you're thinking about what that site's going to look like in 30 years. And so that's really, I mean, it is our selling strategy that we're here for the long term. You're going to get good performance, and your site is going to be well maintained.
Excellent. So we've got some time left to take some questions from our audience, if there are some of those queued up, and I do see a couple that have come in. Here's a really good one, and it touches on a point that I brought up at the beginning. I also wonder about this. How are different O&M providers or owners using some of the intelligent imaging and newer technology to reduce time troubleshooting systems and arrays? How's the use of this aerial thermal imaging and other technologies helping with that? Is it cutting out time? Is it lowering expenses? Is it finding more anomalies and better ones that would have been a problem lingering there? Ben, has DNV had any look at some of those technologies and how they would affect the long term of the industry?
Absolutely. And we now, in our standard diligence, when we see an O&M agreement or a handover takeover situation with an EPC agreement, we always look for that aerial thermal imaging. That's a huge one. That's obviously the industry standard nowadays is actually aerial thermal scanning. That also usually includes visual inspection as well, where you can see some soiling and see some module cracking. However, it's always important to know that not all aerial thermal scanning is the same. My manager reminds me of that every time. She used to be in that industry, and the variance in scope can be massive. And it should also be noted that even if you have a really good scope of the aerial thermal scanning, you get a result. That result doesn't necessarily mean it's actionable. You can have a single cell down on a module, and it might not trigger a warranty on that module or string. So you just have to keep that in mind when you're performing that instrument, that instrumentation. I'll leave it to, I think, maybe one of the people more involved in the costs of O&M and work in O&M just to illustrate further about the field work needed.
Yeah, for us, it's really driven down some of the tech time in the field. We've replaced, especially string current checks with that, module inspections up front, and we do, of course, annual module inspections, and more often than annual if we need to, if we suspect a problem. But the space is really developing beyond that, even to do some pretty cool stuff, and including looking at tracker anomalies. So we don't do our tracker availability that way, but when we do a scan, we do check our tracker availability tool with the results from the scan. So about once a year, we get a check of our tools. And then, extreme vegetation management. So if you really had a wild problem on the site, it can even take pictures and tell you how your veg management is doing. But the part I really like, that's really developing, and I would love to hear from some providers who are doing this directly, is that post-in processing, where they're using all of this data to inform your future maintenance on the site. And so we're really benefiting from all that right now, and I only expect it to expand. Interesting.
Not to mention the safety features as well. I mean, I've been in the field where using string measurement devices have failed and have caused an arc flash in someone's hand. So it's such a benefit. It's really one of the big game changers in the last 10 years plus with for O&M. So huge deal.
Really interesting, and for anybody in the audience who's not familiar with arc flash, it's basically like having a fire the same heat as the sun 3 feet away from you. So you want to be really careful and make sure that you're wearing the right PPE for conditions like that.
Thank goodness we were.
Including hearing protection, because it's not quiet when that happens. Really interesting on that. Is there, what we're seeing is that sites that are well below 1 megawatt, say maybe 700 kW and smaller, still lower cost to use the standard VOC IMP type of string test as opposed to aerial thermal. Do any of you
Totally
see?
disagree.
Okay, so
I
you're
totally
seeing it
disagree.
across the board.
I would say Ben's old boss might disagree as well. It is, you don't use drones, you use fixed wing, right? And so
Okay.
then you can cover a large space at once. And so you do it on the portfolio level, you do it on geography, you work with a fixed wing provider to say, I have this, Borrego has assets all over California, right? And the way I worked with Borrego in the past was this part of the state, Central California is this quote, Northern California is this quote, Southern California is this quote, and and you do fixed wing, and that's the way to do it. You're right, you can't do it with a drone that way, and so it doesn't quite pencil, but you can absolutely get the cost so it makes sense for, even the smallest DG sites. I won't say I did it on like a 25 kW one, but we definitely did it on some 75 and 100 kW ones.
That's a great point. Thanks for sharing that. Excellent. What about some of those other new technologies? Have you folks experimented with robotic washing or anything like that? Are there other technologies that we all want to be looking at?
I have experimented with robotic washing. I'm still in the process of getting to like it. But it's really, washing is one of those things that if you take it in-house, you just need to be ready for the manpower that goes with that. When someone else is doing the robotic washing, I really like it.
Okay.
We actually, most of our sites are in the Southeast. And so I would have said prior to coming in that you didn't wash sites in the Southeast, but I've been proven wrong. In certain cases, pine soiling is just terrible. And so it takes a good scrub to get that off of there. And you can see losses in the 4 to 5% range if you don't attend to it. But yeah, we wash in the Southeast. We are experimenting with doing that ourselves. So I'll just warn you, it can definitely be worth it. Just make sure you're ready for the personnel investment to both manage it and kind of be able to be mobile and move around to your different sites.
And interestingly, in the Southeast, those Great Smoky Mountains got their name because of that material coming off of pine trees, and it is going to settle on your modules if they're in line with that. So what are some of the other, small things that have popped up, just things that get overlooked, things that get forgotten? They're small, but yet it comes back to that death by 1,000 cuts situation. Are there some more of those?
I actually was going to point out, Lee, we have a question in the Q&A chat center that we might be good to address.
Yeah, excellent. Work management is not always tracked in a queryable database. How important is this? And additionally, is there any significant added value to having this directly integrated with your SCADA system? Work management not always tracked in a database.
Yeah, I can kind of start off on that one. We found it really does have to be tracked on that side. We've seen small issues at 1 or 2 sites, and you start asking questions of, I have the same equipment at my other sites. Is this a potential issue across the fleet? And if you're not tracking it, there's no way to really look for those patterns, to see the patterns come out of it, to address a bigger issue. And then I think Lindsay said it earlier as well, just kind of having that actual data about the reliability of the equipment. We have, I guess, the previous employers and this one as well, we have a preventer list, and we've bumped people off of those lists because they can't handle warranty stuff. And if you don't have actual data to back that up, it's hard to make that decision internally. It takes that away from a gut response into something that's actionable. So yeah, anybody that doesn't have a database really need one. And if it's a small fleet of sites, it could be something as simple as Excel. There's tons of database tools out there with lots of flexibility to, to start grabbing that data.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. Any closing comments from our panelists? It looks like we've reached the top of the hour, and looks like we'll need to close out here. But if anybody had any last message to toss in, go ahead.
I'll toss in a brief note about PTC coming up, the decision to go with the new Biden Act, with the Build Back, well, not it's called the Build Back Better, but Inflation Reduction Act, sorry.
Yep.
That there is now PTC that's going to have a big impact. And I think that going forward from DNV's perspective, operational work and availability is going to become a much larger factor, and it's going to be visible in the equity planning stage. So in the financing stage, development, really early development, because now you're linked with the tax credit over time rather than just up front. So it's going to be a much larger thing going forward. And I think availability and performance and bankability studies and fleet-wide assessments, as you were mentioning there, Lee, that you have some access to will become much more important going forward in the development stage.
I would agree, and that was going to be one of my closing comments as well. With the legislation signed recently by President Biden, we are about to embark on another exciting period in the renewable energy industry. I'm really looking forward to it. Keep your hands and feet inside the ride at all times. It will be exciting and fun, and I really look forward to the journey with all of you. We'd love to continue this conversation next month. Many of us will be out at the RE+ show and conference at Anaheim. We'll be in booth 2360 there, so feel free to stop by and chat with us. And we will be putting most of this information that we've gathered here today into one of our blog posts on our website, so feel free to check that out and continue the learning process. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today for taking the time to put this together, and thank you to everybody in the audience for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the week and stay safe. Thank you.